congregation may be seated and be at peace. The study of writing sermons and delivering sermons has a fancy name. That name is homiletics. And professors of homiletics have very specific ideas about how sermons are supposed to be crafted and delivered. And they have rules, and they put those rules in your head. Some of them I have never forgotten. My professor said that you should never, ever quote poetry. Others say, former one at Union Seminary, no longer there, that you should never, ever end the sermon with words like, "Thanks be to God," or "Amen." And others say that you should never, ever, ever tell stories about yourself or your family. But I like to tell stories. I like to tell stories about all the crazy characters who have inhabited my past. But how much is too much? When do sermons stop being sermons and become some guy in a black dress with a stand-up routine? Do you really, really want to know all of the details of my messy, dysfunctional extended family?
Bring it on.
Well, Anne, I have stories that are too dark for sermons and too embarrassing for public revelation. And I have those kinds of stories precisely because I have a family. Families can be wonderful things, and families can be test tubes of dysfunction. Every generation, everybody who is prepared to bring children in the world, they all say the same thing, that they will not repeat the mistakes of the past. And yet our children's children sit in therapist offices to tell tales. A wise person once told me that you could trust the veracity of the Bible because it never tries to pretty up the human condition. Instead, it boldly declares that God redeems that messiness and dysfunction and uses it for good. And as if to underscore that point, Jesus uses a dysfunctional family in one of his greatest hits. Once upon a time, there was a man with 2 sons, he said. One day, the baby of the family came to the father and demanded a reading of the will before the old man was even dead. Inexplicably, the father acquiesced. He sold off part of the farm, which was never done because land, you see, was a gift from God, and land was to be passed from one generation to the next. But the old man did it anyway. Sonny Boy took the money and got on the first bus out of that hick town, and he went to a distant place, a place like New York, where he could reinvent himself and live in blissful anonymity. He gave lavish parties and made lots of trendy new friends. But one fateful day, the crops failed and the stock market lurched and the bottom fell out of everybody's lives. And this rich young man was suddenly homeless and hungry and without a support system of his family. And then, worst of all, for the first time ever, he had to look for a job. And all he could find was work slopping the hogs, and his belly was so empty that the slop made his mouth water. He had never been so low. But one day a light bulb turned on in his head, and he thought, aha! Even the servants at Dad's house are living so much better than I am. Maybe if I I eat a little humble pie, that old fool will forgive me. And so he started home, rehearsing his lines along the way. Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands. And he kept saying it and saying it. Some scholars suggest that there is absolutely no indication in this story that he is really sorry about anything. He's just desperate and hungry. One day, while he was still a long way off, his father saw him. And that's because the old man used to sit in a tower all day long, pining after this long-lost son. And one day he could not believe his eyes, because there he was, and he ran out to meet Sonny Boy, hugging him and kissing him and crying on his shoulder. Well, frankly, this ticked the son off a little bit because he wanted to give his well-rehearsed speech. And so he pushed his father back to arm's length and said, Father, I've sinned against you and against heaven. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But his dad didn't hear a word of it. He was too busy telling the servants to go fetch a new robe and a diamond ring and some shiny shoes and kill the fatted calf, he said. Because my son was lost and now he's found. Well, it was the biggest party that this village had ever seen. It needed to be. You see, the son had publicly humiliated his family, so there had to be a public reconciliation, and a party was the way to do that. Now, the older brother had been out in the fields working all day, and when he got close to home, dirty and bone-tired and sweaty and needing a shower, he heard music and laughter and smelled the barbecue. What's up? He asked a servant. And once he heard the news, he was full of rage. He refused to step 1 foot in that house, which was a public insult to his father. And so Dad got up from the table and began to plead, but the eldest son was unmoved. You have never, ever done anything like that for me in my entire life. And all I have ever done for you is work hard and be honest and respectful and do my duty. But my no-good brother, who spent the family fortune on prostitutes, decides to come home and you give him a party. Well, that bit about prostitutes had never been mentioned in this story before. But you know how it is when you're angry. You make stuff up. The story ends. Jesus ends this story, one of his greatest hits, with the family dispute unresolved. We have no idea if the younger son was ever really sorry. We don't know if the older son ever came inside to celebrate that day. We have no idea if those two brothers ever made peace with one another and gave the old man any rest. How like a family. The traditional way to interpret this parable is that the younger son is anybody, all of us, any of us who's ever really, really screwed up and hurt the ones you love. And the older son is anyone, any of us, all of us who have ever seethed with resentment at the one who screwed up. Neither of these characters is very sympathetic. They're both lost in their dysfunction. Now, most folks think that the Father is supposed to represent God, but that too is problematic, at least for some people, because you see the Father is dysfunctional also. Think about it. First of all, the father gave in and gave the brat what he demanded. Broke up the family farm. He could have, perhaps should have, simply said no. Second, the father sat around and pined away for this wayward son, something a good patriarch was most unlikely to ever do. He could have decided to save face with the village and his family that this son was as good as dead. There was even a ceremony to declare him dead to the family and save face. Third, the patriarch, upon seeing his returning son, hoisted up his robes and ran out of the house and down the lane to meet him. Aristotle once said, "Great men never run in public." And they didn't. It was below their station to do so. It was something a mother would have done. And he certainly wouldn't have hugged this boy and kissed him so emotionally. The Greek implies that he literally covered his son with kisses. Fourth, when the older son refused to come into the party, the father got up from his place at the head of the banquet table in front of the whole village. He left his guest alone. Another breach, a big one, of the social contract. And he pleaded with his son. But the head of the family didn't need to plead with anybody about anything ever. He was the patriarch. He was a man. He was a landowner. Let alone plead with the son, who was at that moment embarrassing him publicly. So while that father is sympathetic maybe to us, us sentimental 21st century Americans, for that first audience who heard Jesus spin this tale, he was just as dysfunctional as his sons. He broke just as many rules as they did, but with one significant difference. The younger son broke the rules out of selfishness. The older son broke the rules out of pride, but the old man broke all of the rules out of love alone. Wait a minute. God doesn't break the rules. God makes the rules. That's what people say. That's what people say all the time, but that's not actually what the Bible teaches. Instead, again and again and again, in the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament, the Christian Bible, God is presented as the one who is constantly, always, and often creatively breaking the rules and smashing any taboo that gets in the way of love, justice, righteousness. Some scholars suggest that another way to read this parable is that the father figure isn't God, but actually the father is really the church. We too are seen as the ones who make the rules. Law and order is our game, except, of course, it isn't. The church's game in this world. The church's job in this world is to break any rule and challenge any theology or philosophy or politician who gets in the way of love road, you break the rule. And I am convinced that the success of this congregation as we prepare for a brand new chapter will be defined by how willing we are to leave our places of honor and decorum and tradition and run out to meet anyone and everyone who has ever thought about trying to come home. Thanks be to God.